Thank you so much, Isabel. I am delighted to be again in one of the Fright seminars, which I don't know if people know, but it's the seminars that unite a lot of researchers in Edinburgh that work on food. And so basically these seminars are there in order to do that, to bring all these people together, I think. Now, so I thought that this book launch would be a good event, I think, for this Pride. And I am really happy that a lot of people who have contributed chapters to this book are here today. I can't see now if anybody else joined, but you will see who it is later. I want to start with this question, and I know that people who wrote those chapters will recognize some of it, but if you haven't written a chapter, do you know people or any people here? Can you recognize them? Anybody? You can do maybe in the chat. I can't see the chat, but maybe Isabel can help me. Anyone know anybody here?
I know one person, and that's Margaret Patton.
Okay. Anybody else?
I can Kurt the drummer.
Okay, you know him? Yeah, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, anyone else? I think probably, given that nobody, not many people have jumped in and said, oh my God, we know everybody. It does show how unknown these cooking personalities of European television are. And if we do know any, usually it is the ones that come from Britain. So people know maybe Patton or Harben, maybe British people will know those, and maybe people know somebody who is closer to their cultural, so to say, environment. Yeah, so like this is how Martin, I imagine you know somebody who is from Germany. And I think this shows why this book is required as well, yeah, because these people are largely unknown to outside of their immediate environments. Here I have some lovely pictures of these people. And I'm not going to tell you who is who now, okay. But so let's start. The book is entitled Food and Cooking on Early Television in Europe. It is fairly self-explanatory, I would say, in that title. It brings together two areas of research. One is food and cooking on television, and the other one is early television in Europe, and kind of brings them together. Now, we all are aware, especially coming from more food studies perspective, I would say that food television in particular today, there is a lot of interest in food television, and particularly contemporary food television in terms of all kinds of things like gender roles and so on and so forth, celebrity, significance of that to contemporary popular culture and so on. And there is also a lot of research on that, in particular on Anglo American, Australian kind of contemporary chefs like Nigella Lawson and Jamie Oliver and so on. And then you have, of course, also the question of food television and other food texts, and that relationship is very interesting in one way, in how food television emerges as one site in which food is represented. And that happens from the 30s, 40s, and then 50s of the previous century onwards. And what is the relationship of those television texts to other texts, like cookbooks? I say in my introduction that food always was one of the first things that appears in any new invention, new technology, that we invent for writing. For example, it was one of the first things to be printed, cookery books, for example. It appeared on very early radio, cooking advice. It appears also in very early magazines and so on. And so it also appears in very early television, like that. But at the same time, very early television as well is able to then kind of recontextualize that content to cookery books and to magazines and so on. There is a lot of scholarly interest in contemporary food television, as I said, and there is also almost no interest in non-European early food television. Okay, there is a massive gap in that you don't find a lot of work in stuff that what did I say here? Mostly non-European. I think what I want to say is maybe non-Western. A lot of work in Anglo, even early Anglo. Like in America, you have work on early food television, not so much in Europe. Okay, but also not other parts of the world so much. So this is one section when we think about food and cooking on television and television as a place where this cooking can feature. And the other part is just thinking about early television in Europe and the technological development that television is, and that it allows as the development to bring to people's living rooms this moving image that then, teaches them, entertains them, and so on through food. In the 50s and 60s, when we think about early television, we really think these first decades of post-war times. Yeah. The question then, of course, is also of Europe after the Second World War and everything that's going on. In a way, this is why I think this collection is, in a way, coherent, because it discusses Europe as it emerges after the war, and the developments that happen in Europe, and how then television and food television fits into that environment. And I don't think I need to go very deeply into Europe after the Second World War. I think everybody knows that that a consequence of war were there, and that partially, specifically in the 50s and 60s, you have massive industrialization, development of new industries, food industries, and so on. And that the standards have risen quite a lot in that time, and people have started to do new things that maybe their parents before the war did not do. In terms of scholarly interest there, you have a lot of interest in women's early television. As far as this early television goes, research goes, you have also interest in specific genres of early television, like ordinary television, where food television potentially could fit in. But there is really not very much research in food specifically. And I think this demonstrates this kind of gap that this book is trying to fill. On one side, in terms of food and studies scholarship, that focuses on contemporary food television, and the early television early television scholarship that doesn't really focus on food. And so here we are bringing all of these together. The aims of the book were several. First of all, it is a space to provide this exploration of early food television across Europe. And this is very important to me as an editor. When I was thinking of this collection, it was very important for me that when we say Europe, we mean Europe. We do not mean just Western Europe, as very often happens, that we go from Portugal on the very west of Europe, all the way to what used to be these more Soviet influenced parts of so-called Eastern Europe. We have here East Germany, we have Czechoslovakia, then there is the example of Yugoslavia, and then other countries like the Netherlands, 2 cases from the UK, France and Italy. So that we have kind of case studies, examples from various parts of Europe, so that we can see how the food television in these very distinct environments emerges and how it functions there. I also thought that this collection assesses what was the purpose of early food television. This was one of these things, does it educate people in cooking? Does it entertain them? Does it inform them on new developments? Does it do something else? Also then, one of the things that it does is explores what food-related genres were there on early television. Very often when we think about food television, we think of cooking. But cooking was just a small part of the way in which food appears on television. You have various other things like advertising. You have just, reports in these very early days of television, reports of what kind of food events there were. Then you have kind of travelogues as well that happen, and so on. And these are covered in the book. Also, another aim was to understand the role early food television played in post-war Europe. What did it do? What was the role in those developments? And to show also some images of early food television. Very important, I think, is that the book does contain many pictures from these very early times of television that demonstrate this food on television. There are some examples here. You see from my left, at least, is Philip Harben. This is from the collection of Kevin Geddes, his article on Philip Harben and Boulestin, how he cooks, and then in the middle from Muller's article on the Netherlands, and then from the Joël Danet's article on France, where he discusses Dim Dam Dong. A very interesting article looking at how this food is used more as art form, criticizing and critiquing the French post-war society in a very particular way. But here you see some of these images that maybe aren't there to be seen just, every day. They are really precious in that way, that they're rare. And so I think that the book does bring some of this imagery forward. Now, of course, working with early television, and anybody who works with early television will tell you that material as is seen by the early audience is not always available. This is early television, very often running live, not recorded. And if there was a recording of that material, very often it's destroyed, lost, or re-recorded. Because who cares about cooking program when you can have something else, and you don't have enough of those cassettes, you just re-record. Now Jacobs here writes about ghost texts. These are reconstructed programs that do not exist in their original audiovisual form, but exist as shadows dispersed and refracted among buried files, bad memories, and flotsam of fragments. In order to reconstruct the way that these shows in the 1950s, 60s, and in the case of Kevin Geddes' article, even before, in the 30s, is really to rely on other material that we need to find. There on top you have an example from Susanna Gomesh's article on Maria Modesto, where she uses a cookbook that accompanied the series in order to provide us an insight into these shows. Of course, articles from various newspapers and magazines that reported about what was there. Diane Charlesworth on the bottom, letters that Margaret Patton received and wrote to other members of the, I think it was the team program committee. And I even attempted looking at how audiences remember these early programs as a way of trying to understand some perception also of this program. This, as you can imagine, is not always available because we are talking of people who are 80, 90 years old. Now I put this ad in the newspaper in Slovenia, hoping that people would respond if they watched these shows. Not very much response, some response. But of course, there is methodological questions. Is this a valid way of doing this or not? And I don't know still. Because, you also have all the perks of oral history and limitations of that. And memory, do they remember, how they remember, and so on. Okay, so here we come to this point where I really want to open it up a little bit more for discussion with the authors of these chapters. What was the role of food television in the fast-changing environment of post-war Europe? There were similarities, there were differences between these parts of Europe, and not always in ways that you would think that there would be differences and similarities. Certainly throughout Europe, you have modernization, that these television shows of new foods are there coming to Europe, not just because you have more imports like bananas, but also because industrialization happens and there are more new foods invented. That can be quicker to make, that can be easier, especially for housewives, to prepare the quick lunch and so on. There was huge drive in that in television, and also technology-wise, that it really, you know, promotes and so on, new devices like cookers and stuff like that. And there was obviously also a promotion of new tastes, new habits, new behaviors, that a lot of people really were interested in how to behave when you eat specific food, what kind of tastes you should engage in. And obviously this is very much related in many cases to class as well, and lifestyles and so on. The question of chefs as celebrities, I think throughout Europe, these chefs who were on television became really famous and people trusted them as these you know, arbiters of taste and who, you know, what they should be doing and so on. And of course, the question is there also, can we talk about celebrities at that time to the same extent as we do today, but also, you know, what was their role as such in promoting these tastes. Then the audience, and in particular female audience as most of it, but not necessarily all, and the gender roles that these shows promoted. In some cases, really cementing the traditional roles that were expected specifically of women, but in some cases, in particular, I would say in the eastern parts of Europe, also really challenging those roles and promoting maybe a little bit different understanding of what is to be a man in particularly, and whether or not a man can cook in the kitchen. In Yugoslavia, I know there was a lot of, you could see in some of those shows, promotion of or encouragement, let's say, of husbands to help their wives in the kitchen. And then finally, there is also this question of, you know, some of these shows building the nation as well. In the case of Portugal and in Italy, building the nation through cuisine and the national cuisine, because it kind of also unites, the television unites us, yeah, as a nation in tastes. There are 10 chapters and a conclusion, including my introduction. Here they are. You see Kevin Geddis's discussion of Bulestan and Harben. Then Diane Charlesworth talks about Marguerite Patten. Ego Müller discusses the early television in the Netherlands. Joël Danet, as I said, culinary art on the French TV, very interesting. Dim Dam, a bit different chapter, I would say, not so much focusing on teaching people how to cook, but really a critique of taste. Francesco Buscemi and Cristina Comunian talk about Mario Soldati and this travelogue traveling around Italy and showing foods that you know, were still there at that time, and that kind of they thought that they are being driven over by the modernization. Nancy Nilgen here, who is also present here, has written about East German television and the challenges of East German television. Then there's my chapter on Ivan Ivačić, a chef from Slovenia in the 1960s. And then Martin Franz talks of Czechoslovak television in the 60s. And Susana Gomes on Portuguese television. And here I was saying a little bit of nation building through that. So I want to go back maybe to the other slide now. And I just want to invite you really, I'm gonna maybe go out of this share screen, because otherwise I can't see anyone. But maybe, you know, we could start with a little discussion on how, in your cases, this modernization could be seen that happened in television, and how television encouraged changes in habits and tastes. Let me see if I can go out of this. Okay. Is my sharing finished? I think so. Yeah. Okay. Any volunteers? Kevin, come on.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I mean, my chapter focuses on, as you've said, a well-known chef before the war and a well-known chef after the war or on TV, both male. So the comparisons between the two are not easily drawn. Before the war, television was very limited in Britain and only available to a few people who lived in London who could afford the new technology and who could receive the signals when Bullistan was cooking. And so he started in 1937 and cooked in 1939. But there had been cooking programs before him in 1936. But I think he was, probably just to answer some of your questions, he was invited to cook on television because he was a celebrity in London. He had a popular restaurant in London. He was a radio celebrity, and he'd been publishing cookbooks on French cookery for well-to-do families and their cooks prior to appearing on TV. So when he arrived, he was already established as a celebrity, already established, and to give advice on high-class French cookery. He died during the war or just after the war, so didn't appear back on TV, obviously, when television began again in Britain. But his place was taken by Philip Harbin, who wanted to somehow capture some of the essence of Bullistan and make himself a celebrity. He too had a restaurant in London. He too had been on radio, and he too had written some cookbooks. But he was much more of a performer. He came from a theatrical family and brought that kind of side of things to TV too.
But Harbin has famously done a lot to promote, the new products of the then growing industry, did he not? To make people do things in a different way and use these new appliances.
Yeah, absolutely. And he wasn't alone in that. So Bullistan before the war too had deals behind the scenes with various companies, whether it was promoting a cooker or products. And he brought them onto screen. I think primarily because my own view is because cooking programs, even at that time, were seen as very experimental and very kind of low grade in terms of television. Not much effort was paid towards them, and certainly not much budget. So the television cooking presenters kind of made a career for themselves in terms of, we'll bring everything with us. We'll bring the cooker, we'll bring all the ingredients, we'll bring everything. Don't worry about anything. You just pay us to present, and we'll have the show. You film it, you capture the sound, etc. So they were able to bring with them products that they were paid to advertise and promote or wanted to. And there's, in the archives, there's lots of behind-the-scenes letters from gas companies who were promoting cookers or particular products that they wanted placed, and also from the government too. And I know that Dan's chapter focuses on Margaret Patton, but the kind of Ministry of Food advice after the war and almost food propaganda advice on what kind of food to cook and promote was really what the television stars in Britain were promoting at that time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Kevin. I want to go to a different part of Europe now, and maybe somewhere where just generally people don't think that this is the case. But Martin wrote in his chapter also about how, these new products were promoted in these cooking shows, as particularly new food products. Do you want to say something about that, Martin?
Yes, this was this show, Wazi Szef Kucharz, was really an advertisement program. This was a part of news, TV news, but this was advertisement of check about new food products. This was part of advertisement from chain of food trade, and in this program was propagated the products, new products as oat flakes and so and propagated the way in communication with the contemporary supply. We have not meat. We need propagated products from flour and vegetables, and we need propagated vegetables in June, but not in, for example, in March, and so. And was important. Special cooks, chiefs from star restaurants propagated oat flakes and this industrial products, meat conserve and so. And this was from luxurious restaurants, the chiefs making from sterilized cabbage and with meat from conserve, and this was propagated from the biggest chiefs, biggest stars of cheese from international on international level.
So when you say international, are you also thinking Western brands, or how did it work? Just more like who are the international?
We have two types of restaurants. One was international restaurants. This was for tourists, and this was for tourists from West.
Okay.
And second was the national restaurants for normal peoples.
Okay.
But this level of celebrities from this show, Vasishevka, this was the chiefs from this international restaurants. This chiefs represented the Czech gastronomy on international level, on Expo in Brussels and in Montreal, and so. This was the international level.
Thank you,
many
Martin.
of this restaurant was the cooking another gastronomy as Czech. This was restaurant, Chinese restaurant, or restaurant Moscow, Russian is Russian gastronomy, and so this was a type of this national representative restaurants. This was the international level.
Okay. Thank you so much, Martin. That reminds me, when you're talking about, this promotion of things that need to be eaten at that particular time. So in winter, no vegetables, but in summer, cherries. Nancy's chapter speaks of that really well, because, there you see the fish case of how fish is promoted, even if fish isn't available, but fish is promoted. Maybe you can say a little bit about that, Nancy.
Yeah, absolutely. In my chapter, I talk about two chefs. That's Kurt Drummer. Martin, you already said that you heard about him or read about him, and even earlier one, Rudolf Krobot. And Rudolf Krobot was known as not just as the TV chef, but as the fish chef. And he was not a chef at first, like Kurt Drummer was. He was not a professional chef. He was a, do you still understand me? Because, okay, all right. He used to be we would say today, marketing manager of the fish combinat in Rostock. That's the harbor city in East Germany. And yeah, basically they had too much fish, and they had to advertise it to the people in the GDR and in East Germany. And but it didn't just have economic reasons. They advertised the fish as well, so the people in East Germany are sort of learning to eat healthier, because like in a lot of other countries, in the Western countries as well, after the Second World War, the increase of the weight and the illness like diabetes that follows with us, it was increasing quite a lot, and so they sort of tried to educate the people to eat a bit more healthy. So it had both reasons to advertise the fish, economic reasons, and because it didn't have that much meat, and healthy reasons as well.
Yeah, but it didn't work. No, you say in your chapter that it didn't really work. People weren't convinced that they should start eating more fish.
They did eat more fish, but they didn't stop eating meat. So they, put the fish on top of it. But actually, they tried in West Germany. They had the same problem, and they tried to advertise eating more fish as well. And it didn't work in West Germany either. So that was a quite interesting fact as well. If you compare the West and the East, they were actually having the same problems.
Yes, I think it's very interesting to think about, to what extent this television actually had an impact on people's lives and in what ways. Clearly not in terms of decreasing amount of fish and then, doing something else, much more subtly, probably. Yes, Martin, do you want to add?
I have two good drummer. Good drummer make the gastronomy diplomacy, but this connection between Czech gastronomy and East Germany was many times in Czechoslovakia, and propagated German cooking, and in his shows was many cooking from the Czech and from Poland, and so make this connections, friendship between socialist bloc.
So in a way, he was also acting as this, bringing the tastes of the outside that maybe wouldn't appear anywhere else or something like that. I don't know. That's very interesting. We could maybe now just have a look at the other side, because a lot of these chefs, especially in Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, were men, with big hats, presenting and being, in many cases, also as professional chefs. But you also have on the other side really just ordinary women cooking on television, who address the audience just as fellow women rather than these professionals. Maybe Diane could tell us something about it, because Diane's case is very interesting in Margaret Patton, and how she negotiated, what should be there on television and who is the audience really there, and what is the relationship with the audience of these women that are there on TV.
Yes. Well, Patton, as Kevin has pointed out, basically had a career before post-war television in radio, and had been actually a voice on the airwaves before she had been somebody on screen in that sense. She was very, very interested in the technology of television as a visual way of actually demonstrating cookery, and very, very concerned, of course, about the whole sort of way in which housewifery was administrated and how food played an important role in that. She wasn't just about food, she was also about domestic arrangements and also sort of the general sort of domesticity. But food was the key thing that the BBC Women's Department wanted to sort of focus around Patton. And so, yes, they were very concerned in the Women's Department in daytime TV after the war to address the idea of the housewife, but understanding, of course, that in Britain in the 1950s, there were an awful lot of women who were working at the time of the sort of broadcast of women's television in the afternoon. So they had a real sort of tension between actually talking about a discourse of housewife, which actually was fairly homogenous in terms of the BBC's representation of that, and actually representing a much more heterogeneous sort of actual identity. And I think Cookery Club in some ways, which was I thought a very particular and very interesting sort of programme that came out of that women's department and which was focused around Patton, was an attempt to sort of straddle that tension between tradition, with you talking about modernisation, tradition actually drawing on housewife expertise that had gone before, and also thinking about sort of modernity as well, and new things post-war in the Reconstructionist period, thinking about things about, like, you know, people having been in contact with other cultures as a consequence of the war, with of course as well migration again post-war, and therefore an increase in migration, British Commonwealth migration in particular, those sorts of things that, you know, the traditional and the modern were sort of being incorporated into that programme, and also the move from rationing and things that were scarce into something that was actually trying to build itself as coming out of that period of rationing and into something that was more plentiful again. So of course your foods were changing, they were becoming more you know, you saw as rationing finished in Britain in the sort of mid-50s, that you started to see recipes that were taking on board the greater sort of variety of food, and also the nuances of migration and the way in which it was playing out, and travel, of course, as you say, you start to see travel as well as being part of the post-war consumer society as you get to the sort of end of the 50s and into the 60s. And she was negotiating all of that with this particular Cookery Club, and Cookery Club was actually about involving the audience. So they asked audiences. Patton came up with a recipe, that a specific named recipe, and then the audience sort of sent in their recipes, their versions of those recipes. And you were talking about the ordinary housewife. They had this sort of publicity that, you know, Patton went away with all of these letters and all of these examples from the audience, and actually made them all up in her kitchen back in Brighton Hove. And then came back and sort of said, these are the ones that I think should be runners up, and these are the ones that I think this is the winner for this particular week. And it was a way of sort of engaging the audience, what I called the one of the early audience participation shows, by actually really trying to cement this relationship with the viewers.
Thank you, Diane. I think you opened two important points here for me, really interesting. One is this, idea of engaging with the audience, which I think Susanna could tell us something about as well, just in a second. But the other one is also this interplay between tradition and modernity, and how to accommodate this, even if invented tradition in a way, that at that time with something new, so that they can both be accommodated. And I think Susanna again has a nice point, because in Portugal this played out in such an interesting way, both of these things. So maybe Susanna, you want to say something on this?
Yes. Yes, the TV show of Maria de Lourdes Modesto here in Portugal is a case of popularity. It's such an influence in national culinary that in identities and in heritage and culture, in culinary culture, that still today she is a central name in our tradition, culinary tradition. And our TV show is very interesting because there you can see class, you can see gender, you can see politics and even ideology intertwined. And we must not forget that by the 60s, where the program was on airs from 58 to 73, it was a case of popularity. We had a dictatorship that was called Estado Novo with fascist characteristics. There was censorship, it was really difficult, and this TV program, this TV show became an instrument, a means of political propaganda. And in the beginning, there was this French tradition, and the TV host was promoting a kind of French cuisine. And then it was the public, the audience was upper class audience. But then she made something very important at the time, and she promoted a contest within the program where the audience would send their family receipts, and it was such a success for having people from middle classes participating. They were so enthusiastic that they sent their family receipts from their region, from their different regions in Portugal. So they constitute a guide, a corpus of information from national cuisine, and actually they create Portuguese cuisine. And this was under the umbrella of the political power. They had a propaganda director, and he was directly involved with this TV show. In the beginning, the program was mainly, the show was mainly directed to teach young women to become good housewives. And then the phenomenon was so huge that we have men cooking. And in Portugal, in the Portugal of the 60s, that was something, to have men participating in the show, sending recipes. That means a lot. Mm-hmm. The TV host, she was considered at a certain point by the New York Times as the Portuguese Julia's Child.
Yes. It's interesting, this reference to Julia Child, because I think this reference to Julia Child in relationship to all these national, important figures of culinary tradition is always there, and it appears in many contexts. But actually, these people in Europe were, in some cases, even before Julia Child. They were there before her. They cooked on television even before her. So certainly in the case of Yugoslavia, the guy that I wrote about, Ivan Ivačić, appears even before her, which is fascinating to think that a television like the one in Yugoslavia, which was set up in 1958, already in 1959, for example, has somebody like that on television. So thank you so much, Susanna, for this. I think it's so fascinating, just to have you all here together and discuss this book and look at these kind of, in a way, differences and similarities that appear in Europe, many differences, many similarities. We didn't go into differences so much as we did into similarities, because I think it matters to look at it as a European kind of thing. But then you could say, how is this different to something American or something that happens somewhere else? And maybe that's for next time. I want to open now the floor for some questions. If there are any questions, we have quite some people in the audience. So if you have a question, shoot out.
I was going to start.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for Nancy, which is more a question of clarification and a comment. You said that the East German authorities wanted people to eat fish because they wanted them to eat healthier, because they were worried about diabetes and other presumably diet-related diseases. When was this in the 60s? What period was your research looking at?
Yeah, it started. It was actually not just through via these TV shows. It was a large campaign, and the television cooking shows were a part of this eating healthier campaign. And they actually started it in the 60s. Yeah, they have noticed that the people increased weight and unhealthy weight in the late 50s. Then it started to be a problem. You can tell the cookbooks that came on the market at this time started being part of the Southie campaign as well. So yeah, and it went right through the end until the late 80s.
My interest in this, so my PhD research was on the development of the idea of obesity as an epidemic, which, and as far as I'm aware, and you may contradict me because I don't know the Eastern European situation, there wasn't much national level data on body weight. So that would be one comment. And the other comment is that a decade or so ago, populations would have been hungry.
Yeah.
So the thing that really interests me is the switch from malnutrition to overnutrition, which occurred sometimes in the 60s in several parts of Europe. And it's a really fast transition.
It is, definitely.
I've never really figured out what was going on there.
Yeah.
I think some of it is partly to do with an anxiety about economic development and its effect on the health of populations.
Yeah, that is definitely an important point. The regime, the East German regime, was afraid very early that overweight and the illnesses like diabetes might have consequences for the economy, because the people, can't work that well, and that was the thing. So it was not just and I totally agree. I had the same thoughts when I started researching about it, because it took until 1958 before they actually stopped rationing food after the end of the war. 1958, and only a couple of years later they started with this massive campaign to eat more healthy, to reduce weight. So actually I had the same the same questions like yours. Okay, that's not a lot of time, but yeah,
really
maybe it was the fear what will happen when they don't start soon, or maybe they've seen it in the West, because in the West it started earlier with the increasing weight.
I agree with that, but from what I know, there wasn't kind of representative national level data about changing body weights in Europe until about the 1980s. So there's a lot of build up of this discourse of we're all getting fatter and unhealthy.
Yeah.
You
have a whole full-blown show on the Slovenian television, 1973, which is basically to deal with the problem of fat people. That is what that's how it's described.
The same case is in Czechoslovakia. In the 70s, we have a special TV show to obesity. This was this war with obesity with word of calories.
Calories, yes.
Typical person was medicine professor Rajko Doleček from Serbian mother, and this was big propagator to against obesity, and very popular person in 70s, 80s.
Yes, the same in Yugoslavia. Exactly.
Yes, this is the same problem in all Eastern Europe.
Okay, any other questions? We have around 5 minutes more. Yeah, Taya in Brazzo, please.
Hello?
Hello, do you want to say it? We can't hear you right now. I think the microphone is muted. If you don't want, otherwise you can type it. We still can't hear. I don't know why. No. Taya, do you want to say it? I think maybe some trouble with the microphone. It seems to be muted for now.
Yeah. And I can't unmute.
No. We'll give a minute to Taya to figure out the microphone. Or if you want, you can type it. If that doesn't work. Is there anybody else who would like to ask a question in the meantime? Yeah, Martin?
I have a question to Nancy. Was propagated the fish eating as German national tradition or so?
So you mean if in Portugal they also were propagating fish?
In East Germany, this fish eating as German national tradition?
I didn't particularly check on this, but as far as I'm concerned, no, they didn't. They were trying to make a new East German cuisine, but as far as I'm concerned with the TV chefs, they were not part of it, at least not the fish thing. That the fish is like an East German. No, not really, not as far as I'm concerned. But I have to be honest, I didn't particularly look at this. So, but it might be very interesting to do that. Thank you for the question.
Thank you.
Taya, did you manage to fix the microphone? No. Oh, that's a shame. Anybody else? No. I wanted to ask Kevin. Maybe Kevin specializes in this very early British food television. He's doing a PhD in early cooking shows. Maybe could you tell us something about pre-war television, because that is something very special in Britain. Most of other Europe only has television after the war, but in Britain you already have these cooking shows as limited as they were before the war. So maybe if you can say something about that.
Yeah, there was actually a huge variety, just I guess as we're all saying, you know, not just cooking programs, but lots of programs that featured food. So in the first few months actually of television broadcast in 1936, so November and December were the first 2 months in 1936 that television programs were broadcast. There were fairly regular programs which featured food. The first of these featured someone called Rosina Dixon, who was known as the singing cook, and she sang as she cooked, or really she just rolled pastry. You can look her up on YouTube and see her in action. But she was part of a kind of chat show, if you like, talking about her personality and her performance on stage, and she toured around Britain and went to different theatres with her act. But there was also chefs who displayed culinary art and showed how to dress tables and dress plates effectively. There were food competitions and quizzes, those kinds of things too. There was a particularly famous one called Blind Man's Buffet, which is a bit of a pun in English on Blind Man's Buff, where contestants were blindfolded and fed food, and they had to guess what it was around a table, those kind of things. So not just cooking, although cooking was very important, but I think, Anna, just as you said earlier, the feature of food and the connections with different aspects of class and domesticity were important right from the beginning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Kevin. I think we're running out of time now. I want to maybe close this from my side and then give the final voice, so to say, to minute to Isabel. Thank you so much to everybody, you know, that you managed to come. I think it was a wonderful discussion, wonderful to see you all. Maybe there will be another project at some other time on a similar topic, who knows. Thank you also to Isabel to accommodate this into the Fright Show. Really very nice, and thanks a lot.